We are starting chapter 16. Big milestone event, starting a new chapter. Anytime that happens, we have to have some simcha. Well, the siyum is when you conclude the previous chapter. Now you need to have a celebration to start the new chapter. So, chapter 16, page 68. In the, never judge a chapter by its length.
By the number of pages.
So, correct, never judge by the number of pages. So, chapter 16. Page 68, right towards the top of the page. Let's just quickly review what it is that we learned about in the previous chapter, where the primary theme of the previous chapter was the idea of working a little bit extra, pushing ourselves extra mile. The difference between doing something 100 times versus doing something 101 times. The idea that if we just simply repeat things that are comfortable for us, that's not nearly good enough in terms of spiritual progress. And so you could have somebody who's a Beinoni, which is a highly advanced state of spirituality, and yet they could be considered somebody who has never served Hashem, because it could be that they're a Beinoni because that's who they are, not because of that's what they've done. And that's really what the theme was of the previous chapter, is that it's very much about serving Hashem, doing work, things that are challenging for us, that push us beyond ourselves. That's what really, really counts. And just to glide along doing great things that are natural for us, that's not a big deal, and it's not a great achievement. So towards the end of the chapter, we had to address a very important question, which is, how do you do this? How does a person motivate themselves to go the extra mile? How does a person push themselves to 110%? What's the mechanism? And so, anybody remember how we ended off? What's the secret?
100 times.
What does it take? No, that's what you do. Doing it 101 times is what you do. But how do you get yourself motivated to meditate, right? Correct, exactly. So we said that you have to meditate on Hashem's greatness. And the more you bring into focus how great Hashem is, the more that will develop your love towards Hashem. The more you love Hashem, the more likely you are to go the extra mile. That's human nature. Then when we're in love with someone, we do things for them that don't make any sense. We go way beyond the call of duty. And so if we have this love towards Hashem, we'll certainly go way beyond the call of duty. And that's pretty much how we wrapped up the previous chapter. So there were two takeaway points. The first one is never be satisfied with things that come easily, and always look to be able to serve Hashem, which means to do something which is difficult, challenging, outside of the ordinary. And secondly, in order to get to do that, you have to have a mechanism that you could use to develop a meaningful love towards Hashem. That mechanism is meditation, contemplation about Hashem's greatness, and that will motivate you. Now, at this point, you may have a question. Maybe you don't, I don't know, but you may have a question. And the question may be, okay, so how long is this going to take?
Your whole life.
Right? If the idea is to meditate on Hashem's greatness, to the extent that you develop this meaningful passion towards Hashem, maybe it's going to take more than a lifetime. Maybe you're being generous when you say it's going to take a lifetime. Maybe you're being generous. Maybe it's going to take multiple lifetimes. Or a slightly different variation on the same question is, what do I do until I get there? You know, there's a Yiddish expression that I love to quote because it's so insightful. And the Yiddish expression goes, Der Eibishter wird helfen. That means God will help. Und bis wird helfen, soll euch helfen. And until Hashem helps us, He should also help us. Which essentially means that life is a journey, and I know the conventional thing is enjoy the ride, but in Judaism, life is a journey, and how do you survive the journey before you get to the destination? Yeah, the destination is a very powerful thing. But you can't make life only about destinations, and you have to have some kind of a plan B of what's going to tide you over until you reach your objectives. And that's exactly what we've got to talk about over here. So maybe reaching a point of this passionate, driven, overwhelming love towards Hashem, maybe that is a long way off. And what do I do in the interim? Or perhaps a slightly different perspective on this is, what happens in the process, because I'm going to work on this process of developing a relationship with Hashem and a love towards Hashem, what happens in that process before the passion hits? Because you have to remember that that's the nature of the human being, that we come in waves. pretty much like the Zoom, which, by the way, just went off. Things come in waves, right? So we have our moments, we have our ups, we have our downs. That's why you got to be here in person, because when when you're trying to connect on the Zoom, you don't know. It's not necessarily reliable. One minute you're there, the next minute you're not there anymore. So the point is, we are creatures of ups and downs. That is our reality. And we are not necessarily a reliable bunch. And any process that we go through has to have stages in that process. So what are we going to do when we're in the early stage of the process? We haven't yet developed this passionate love towards Hashem, but we'd like to be able to drive ourselves and to motivate ourselves to be able to go one step further. So this is a really valuable chapter because it addresses a reality that we face. It addresses the reality of, well, what happens if you're not there? What happens if you don't have the wherewithal? What happens if you cannot bring yourself to have the full-blown experience? Is this a zero-sum game? Is it a matter of either you get it or you don't get it? It's like the story of the person who gets up and gives a talk about public speaking. So all the speakers get up and they say, you've got to use this kind of method and that kind of method, and this is a way to learn how to public speak, etc. And the one guy gets up and he says, either you've got it or you don't. So is that how it works in spirituality? Is that how it works? That either you are where you need to be or you're not where you need to be. Either you're at 100% or you're at 0. Is that how it works? I think you can preempt from the way I'm saying it that that's obviously not how it works.
That's the way it is socially.
So, is it?
Socially, you can, you've got to do, you don't.
Yeah, okay.
Socially, not.
So, but spiritually, is that how it is?
But you have to want to grow.
Yeah, but grow is such a general term. When people say you have to grow, I don't think half the people who say that even understand what that means. When they say you have to grow, okay, tachlis, practically. So what does that mean? What does grow mean? Does grow mean that I've got a 100-year plan? And don't worry, one day I'm going to get there. But I'm growing every single day. Is that true growth? Because we didn't use the word growth over here. We used the word service. So the implication is that you actually have to be doing something rather than having some kind of a cumulative plan, this over time I'm going to build up. There's an element of effort, there's an element of investment, there's an element of challenging ourselves. It's not as simple as just to throw out a term which we like to use, like grow, without identifying what that means. Another suggestion is, somebody made the suggestion that you've got to fake it till you make it. You ever heard that expression? You've got to fake it till you make it, which is highly, highly popular in many, many circles. And the question is that good enough for what we're talking about over here? In other words, when people say fake it till you make it, what if you never make it and then your whole life is fake? Got to think about that. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is that a problem? Should we be discouraging people from faking it until they make it? It also depends, I think, what it is that you're faking. So if you're faking loving Hashem, who are you kidding?
Yourself.
Right? There's a story about a chassid who once did something and he was highly, highly embarrassed of what he did because it was a really bad thing. And he wanted to go to the Rebbe, I believe it was the Rebbe Maharash, the 4th Rebbe of Chabad. And he wanted to get some kind of direction about how he could address and reconcile and rehabilitate himself from this terrible thing that he had done. But he was so embarrassed, he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to admit it. So he goes to the Rebbe and he says, I have a friend. My friend did X and Y, but he's so embarrassed. He didn't want to come and ask personally, how he should handle it. So he said, I'm asking for a friend. So the Rebbe says to him, well, why didn't your friend come and say it was you? Okay? So who are we kidding? Who are we kidding? One of the craziest things in life when we try to do things that we're so-called faking is that we actually believe that people fall for it. And they don't. So there is value in, I don't want to use the expression fake it till you make it, but the Gemara does speak about the concept of doing things for misguided reasons because ultimately you'll do them for the right reasons. That's a little different to fake it till you make it. That's essentially saying do the right thing even if what's driving you is not the right motivation. Fake it till you make it could imply that you're doing something which is not the right thing. Then nowhere in Judaism does it say that we should put on a show to satisfy other people. So we've got to analyze what exactly are we saying when we say fake it till you make it. Like what does that actually mean? Okay, here's another suggestion. Another suggestion is just do more mitzvahs. Do more mitzvahs, like the Nike version of Judaism. Right? Just do it. Except the Nike version is the Jewish version is just do it again and again. Right? Nike was happy with you to do it once. But in Judaism, you've got to do more mitzvahs and do more mitzvahs, which is really, really powerful. And of course, there's no question about it that is going to get us into a better spiritual space. There's no question that if you do healthy things, you'll become a healthier person. That's what they call in today's world the power of habit. That when you create a habit, it becomes part of who you are. By the way, the modern world with their power of habit could have woken up a few hundred years ago, where it was said, I think it's the Sefer HaChinuch, I think it says it, that acharei ha'peulos nimshachos halavavos, that when you repeat actions again and again, your heart eventually follows the actions that you're repeating. So the power of habit is not something that was invented in the last 25 years by motivational speakers. It's something that is very much in Judaism. Right? We even spoke about it, by the way. We spoke about it previously in Tanya, the idea of something becoming second nature. We spoke about that a person can habituate, in the previous chapter, that a person can habituate themselves in a particular way until eventually their behavior becomes second nature. So there's no question about it that doing mitzvahs is obviously a powerful thing to do, and it's going to get us along the way of a spiritual path, but that's not the question we're addressing over here. It's not what we should be doing in a practical sense. The question is really, we're going to go a little bit more deeply into this, what level of experience could I have before I have the fullest experience? Okay, so we've identified that in order for a person to be driven to go so far the extra mile in order to do what Hashem wants, that person has to have a deep, meaningful love towards Hashem. In order for a person to have a deep, meaningful love towards Hashem, that person has to contemplate Hashem's greatness on a consistent basis, because that will shift our entire perspective and will get us to where we need to be in terms of this connection to Hashem. But what kind of an experience will I have before I'm there? In other words, is there any depth to my experience as a Jewish person if I'm not yet in this passionate love relationship with Hashem? Or is it just going through the motions? Is it because you can have a person who's doing things 101 times, but it's also going through the motions. It doesn't have any real depth to it. Doesn't have any real personal experience to it. Is that good enough? So that's really what we're going to be analyzing over here today. Well, at least starting in this chapter, we're going to begin to analyze this principle of, well, what depth of experience could I have if I don't yet have anything close to the full experience? So by way of introduction, by way of introduction, he's going to introduce us to two principles over here. Two principles. He's going to say that these are two principles of the Beinoni experience, two principles of the spiritual state called the Beinoni. And essentially, these two principles are going to address this issue of, well, what do you do, or what level of experience do you have when you're not quite at the pinnacle of where you want to be in terms of your spiritual experience? Okay? So let's start. And like I said, there's two key principles over here. So we'll start with the first one. Perek Tezayin, chapter 16, V'zeh klal godol ba'avodas Hashem lebeinonim. Okay, so the first cardinal principle of the Beinoni's spiritual experience, so that's essentially what we're trying to describe over here, is what is the spiritual potential of the Beinoni, what is the experience that the Beinoni has, etc. So what do we say? Zeh klal godol b'Beinoni. This is the general rule of the Beinoni, or at least ba'avodas Hashem lebeinonim. This is the general rule of how a Beinoni serves Hashem. So what's the first general rule? Ha'ikarahu, the primary focus has to be limshoil Velishloit ala teva shebechol asmoli. The primary focus has to be, there are two words that he uses over here, but they effectively represent the same concept, to rule over, to dominate the nature that we have because of the so-called left side of the heart. Now, we did discuss this. We've discussed this in the previous chapter. We've discussed it in earlier chapters as well, where essentially we live on a dual operating system. So back in chapter 2, we spoke about the fact that there's a godly soul and there is an animal soul. And then later on in chapter 6, but especially in chapter 9, we expressed that the godly soul primarily operates through the intellect and the animal soul primarily operates through impulses. So those are the two primary states that a person could be in. You could be in an objective, analytical state, or you could be in an impulsive state, okay? Now, of course, there are many, many other variations, but those are the two general areas where we operate. So let's use an example that we could all relate to. Maybe we can't all relate to. But let's say that there's a person who is sitting at the Shabbos table. Now, one of the things that happens at the Shabbos table, maybe it doesn't happen at your Shabbos table, but I think it happens at most Shabbos tables, is there is more food than what we should be eating. So now you're at the Shabbos table.
You can't relate?
And you can't relate, right? And at the Shabbos table, they have, 4-course meal. Let's just say at the Shabbos table. Whether you count challah as a course is debatable. So we'll call it a 5-course meal, right? Okay. So they bring out the challah right at the beginning of the Shabbos meal. And it's freshly baked, homemade challah. And if you come from certain parts of the world, it's sourdough challah. Because in certain parts of the world today, if you don't have sourdough challah, are you even Jewish? This is the new thing. This is the new thing. It's replaced sushi. This is now the new thing, right? You've got to have sourdough challah. Okay. So you're at this person's house and they make the most phenomenal sourdough challah, right? Okay, they make this most amazing sourdough challah. And they put out with the challah, they put a whole series of different dips that you could have the challah with. There's, hummus and chveis, I don't know all the things. All this kind of stuff that's on the table. What is one of the most common conversations that people have at the Shabbos table? I shouldn't have so much challah. How often do people make some variation of that comment at a Friday night table, right? I shouldn't have so much challah. But, because that's obviously the next piece, but the challah is just so delicious, there's no way that I could, that I can't have any more. And so you'll end up having the second slice, which, by the way, the second slice is probably still a mitzvah. The third slice is already excessive, right? So now what's going on through a person's experience when they are faced with the onslaught of challah? What's going on through their experience?
Shabbos doesn't count.
No, Shabbos, that's already too advanced. Shabbos doesn't count. The calories don't count. Exactly. There is the objective perspective and there's the impulsive perspective. So the objective perspective says, I know what this is. I've been to 1 or 2 Shabbos meals in my life. I know what's still coming. Still going to be fish and salads and soup with kanedelach and meat and kugel and vegetables and dessert. So my intellectual side, my objective side says, don't overdo the challah. Have your slice of challah, or if you want to know halachically how much challah you have to have, so you consult with your rabbi so you know exactly how much challah you have to have. Have your basic requirement of challah. And zehu. That's it. Move on. Have a piece of gefilte fish after that, But then we have an impulsive side, and the impulsive side says, maybe this week, magically, I'll be able to eat all that challah and still not feel like a stuffed whatever by the time I've eaten everything else. It's completely irrational, but that's the impulsive side. So therefore he tells us, if you want to know what the core is of what makes a Beinoni, why they become such spiritual superstars, it's this. This is their secret. The ability to control the impulsive nature of humans. And if you think about it,
Not only with food.
no, food was just a very, very superficial example. But with everything in life. And by the way, the minute you think about this, if you just pause for a moment, you actually think about this concept, impulse control is probably one of the most lacking components of modern society. Impulse control. And here he's saying that the core of all Beinoni development is impulse control. Right? That to be able to have absolute control over the nature that we have on the left side of the heart, which is the impulsive nature. So think about this for a second, just to give you a couple of examples before we go further. So there's a principle that we teach in Chabad. It's a principle called iskafia. I don't know if you've ever heard this principle. And iskafia is a principle. I'm going to use food as an example again, but it's not only food, so maybe we'll find another example. It's not only food. Iskafia is an Aramaic term, and it means to overwhelm or to control or to cause to be submissive. Basically, what it means is that in our experience, there are certain things that the Torah says we may not do, and there are certain things that the Torah says we may do. And most of us make a mistake to think that if the Torah says we may, it actually said we must. And there's a very big difference. So, if there's something that the Torah says I'm not allowed to do, my attitude should be under no circumstances. In other words, the way that we're supposed to live is if the Torah says that's forbidden, we have to see it as that's poison.
How else could you say it?
How else could you see it?
Not forbidden for me.
Many people say, no, it's forbidden, but I'm not holding there yet. My circumstances dictate that I have to be able to do this. You don't understand.
Not holding it.
You what?
Not in the time of the temple. I don't have to
It doesn't have to be as much as in the time of the temple. You could have a very simple example that any one of us could relate to. It is absolutely forbidden to speak negatively about another person. Who feels that that's poison? I mean, in theory, we do. In theory, we'll use that expression, we'll say it's poison, But in reality, boy, oh boy, do I have to tell you this. It's very important information. You need to have this information, because if you don't have this information, perhaps you'll be vulnerable to this person, whatever the case. We have 1,000,001 reasons to justify taking that poison. Would you like another example? I'll give you another example. Okay? Imagine that somebody sat down at a restaurant and they brought you, imagine the waiter brings you at the restaurant a little vial that's got the skull and crossbones on it.
drink this.
And says, this is our special of the day. Imagine, say, this is our special of the day. There's absolutely no question about it that you would, under no circumstances, partake.
If we're at a restaurant, surely it must be safe. Maybe it's just got the...
Okay?
That's the
Okay?
logic. That's
Exactly.
the logic again.
Exactly. So from a Torah perspective, if the special of the day is not kosher, it's poison. We don't think that way. We don't. We should think that way. So Hasidim used to have an expression that goes like this. They used to say that if a person hasn't been exposed to Hasidus, then their attitude to spirituality is going to sound something like this. I'm going to say it first in Yiddish, and then we'll say it in English. So they used to say that if a person is exposed to Hasidus, then you'll know, was men tornit, tormenit, ad sheteitze nishmascha. If you're not allowed something, then you're absolutely not allowed it at all costs, even to the point of death. Because you're not allowed it. On was men meg, and what you are allowed, darf men it, you don't necessarily have to have. Whereas a person who hasn't been trained in the way of Hasidus, the natural attitude is, was men meg, megmen, ad sheteitze nishmascha. What we're permitted to have, we are absolutely permitted to have at all costs, even at the cost of our own well-being. On was men tornit, and what we're not allowed, megmen oichet abissel. You're also actually allowed a little bit. In other words, what it's saying is that the nature of the human being, the impulsive nature of the human being is to permit ourselves small doses of poison. It's part of the human condition. You think I'm exaggerating? It's really simple. How many people on this planet smoke micro doses of poison? How many people on this planet drink more alcohol than they should? Micro doses of poison. How many people have refined sugar in pretty much everything they eat? Micro doses of poison.
It's allowed.
The human, exactly. Was men meg. That's what we're allowed. So the nature of the human condition is to convince ourselves that it's not a matter of whether something is healthy or unhealthy. It's a matter of how much of it we have. It's a fascinating thing. We all do it. I'm allowed a little bit of my vices. And everybody has their vices. And you could apply this across the board. It's such an endemic part of the human experience. Here's another example. Totally unrelated to indulgence. Here's another example. Is it healthy to waste time? Let me take it from a different perspective. So, God forbid you have to visit somebody who's in hospice. I don't know if you've ever had to do that, right? God forbid you have to go visit a person in hospice. You can't watch that and walk out of there thinking, I can just live as I did. Automatic, it's just natural to believe, I have to make life more worthwhile. I have to, because life is short. Suddenly you realize life is short.
For a while.
And then what happens? We microdose time wasting. Microdose. I'm not, God forbid, going to waste my whole life. I'm just going to waste 2 hours right now binging my favorite series when I could be sleeping so that tomorrow morning I could wake up refreshed. But you know what? It's a microdose. I'm not destroying my life. I'm just catching up on a few seasons of whatever.
Discipline and control.
Right? So, I'm saying, what is human nature? Human nature is to convince ourselves that the issue is not whether something is healthy or unhealthy. The issue is the dosage.
Maybe it's not human nature. Maybe it's society.
It's absolutely human nature.
Maybe society's teaching.
If it was that way, so how does society get to be that way? How does society get to the point to believe that it could microdose on unhealthy things? What, is this something new that was invented in the 20th or the 21st century? Because people did not indulge, people did not engage in unhealthy behaviors. The Gemara tells us that Adam doyeg al ibud domov, that a person worries about losing money. This is the Gemara, almost 2,000 years ago. The Eino doyeg al ibud yomov, and does not worry about the loss of days. And then the Gemara continues, Domov choizrin. If you lose money, you can always get it back. Yomov einom choizrin. And days you cannot get back. And the only time we realize that we can't get days back is in the later years. That's when a person chapsech suddenly waits up. You can't catch up on days. And everybody knows this as a principle, but in practice, it's okay. Just now, just in this moment, I'm going to waste a bit of time, play around, doom scroll through my social media feed, or whatever the particular case. And we're all guilty of this. Why? Because it is human nature. Why is it human nature? Because the raw human is an impulsive creature. And impulsive creatures go for the feel-good now experience rather than the long-term investment experience.
I have a question. We comparing compulsive to the animalistic part of us. Yet animals, if you think of it, lions or whatever, they only catch to eat what they need and that's it. Do they overdo? Are they impulsive?
Okay, so here's the difference. No, it's a very, very good point. So essentially what you're saying is, and I don't want to mix the metaphors of here, so we have to make this very clear. Are animals impulsive? 100% yes. Now, can animals be intentional? Yes, they can be intentional as well. So you watch the weaver bird, and you can see how intentional both the male is in making the nest, and the female is in assessing the whether the nest is good enough or not. So yes, absolutely.
Is it impulsive or is it their complete nature?
Well, it's the impulsive nature. Meaning to say, okay, you want to say it's instinctual. That's their instinct. Meaning to say, the weaver bird cannot decide this season we're not doing a hanging nest. This season we're doing a different design. It's not possible because it's instinctual. But there's an impulsive element to it as well, which means that if there's a predator and that predator needs to eat, then the impulse will drive it to attack its prey. It's not going to have the capacity to say, maybe I've already overindulged and maybe I've put on a bit too much weight. So there's that part of ourselves, which is the animalistic part of ourselves. It's impulsive. We are different creatures to animals for a variety of reasons. First of all, because we function at a higher level. Therefore, we're able to entertain multiple impulses, whereas animals will typically entertain impulses for survival and propagation. And the second thing is that we are also exposed to a broader array of temptations than what animals are attracted to, right? What does an animal have in its life already? A mate and shelter and food. Those are really the core things that an animal has to provide for itself. We have the capacity to create things that stimulate us, that entertain us, that give us sensory feedback, etc., etc. So we're very different creatures, but the core principle is impulse. The core principle, the raw human being is an impulsive creature. And if you don't believe that, look at a baby.
But didn't Hashem create us perfectly? It's like as if we've been made...
One second. Who says Hashem created us perfectly?
B'Tselem Elokim.
Yes? What does that mean?
Perfect.
No, that
Hashem
doesn't
is
mean...
perfect.
That does not. We should never make the mistake of believing that Hashem created us as perfect in the same way as we should never make the mistake of thinking that Hashem created anything as perfect. In fact, just this week, somebody sent me a list of each day of creation where the imperfection lies in each day of creation. It was actually fascinating. I thought it was quite smart that he did this. So the first day of creation, Hashem creates light and immediately hides that light because it's too much for the world to handle. So there's an element of imperfection. On the second day of creation, there is the division that's created, discord between the high and the low realms. And so the implication over there is that there's like a demoting, in a sense, of what eventually became water. So there's the high realms, which are the heavens, and there's the low realms, which become water. So there's an imperfection there. In the third day of creation, you have plants. And in the original version, every plant was supposed to be edible, and every tree was supposed to provide fruit. But then this only happened later, didn't happen on the third day. Although according to one opinion, there's already an issue that happened on the third day that led to it. But eventually, trees are not that way, and fruits are not that way, and plants are not that way. Not every plant is edible. Not every fruit produces trees. Not every tree produces fruit. On the fourth day of creation, you have the famous conflict between the sun and the moon, where the moon originally in the Torah is described as a luminary, and then Hashem diminishes it and turns it into just a blank canvas which could reflect light. So there is an imperfection as well. Then on the next day, you've got the creation. Okay, so with birds and fish, I can't remember exactly what he said. And then on the last day, obviously, you've got humans, and that's where you see the greatest example of imperfection. Hashem just deliberately created our world in a state of imperfection so that we could grow. If we were created in a state of perfection, what purpose would there be to the whole of life?
Eating the apple, it's the same debate. I know I shouldn't, but I'll have a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Same concept. So there you have it. So it's built into the human nature. It's built into the very fiber of our beings that we are fundamentally impulsive creatures. And again, have a look at children. Forget about a baby. A baby is very impulsive, right? The baby is born, the second it's already looking to eat. But you watch children, they act in very impulsive ways. That's why, for example, halachically, a child is not, for example, acceptable as a witness, because their impulse is stronger than their rationale. So therefore, they could think one way 1 minute and then think differently the next minute. And they're so vulnerable and so open to influence because we are fundamentally impulsive beings. So the core of becoming a Benoni, which ultimately is the spiritual goal, or should be the spiritual goal of every one of us, starts primarily, that's why we say Klal Gadol, the first core vital principle that you have to know is impulse control. It's a little bit more than impulse control, because we're talking about controlling nature, and to control nature is not just to control impulse. Impulse control is only the first level of this experience. I'll tell you a very powerful story. So there was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, the author of Tanya, and his name was Reb Moshe Meislish. And he was very connected in the political circles. And at the time that Napoleon was on his march against Russia, he managed to infiltrate Napoleon's inner circle and get intel that he passed on to the Russians. That's a crazy story. Napoleon was getting increasingly frustrated with the fact that there was obviously a mole, and he couldn't work out who the mole was. So Napoleon had a way of dealing with people. He was obviously, as you can imagine, a very intimidating individual, despite his short stature. And he would barge into a room and make an accusation against a person, then put his hand on their chest to see if their heart rate went up. And then he'd know, obviously, that they were guilty of what he accused them of.
UK customs do the same
So-
thing when you're standing there, it's measuring your heart.
Okay, so there you go. So he runs into the room. There's this gathering of the inner circle. He runs into the room, and he looks at this chassid, and he says to him, straight, you're a spy, which he was. And he puts his hand on his chest. Nothing.
It's
So afterwards, the
control.
chassidim asked him, how on earth did you do that? Because forget about whether you were a spy. Even if you were not a spy, your heart would be racing. Like, how did you do that? In fact, if you think about it, even the fact that his heart didn't race is suspicious. So he says, is that not what the Alter Rebbe taught us in Tanya? That the mind has to control the heart. The response that we have is an instinctive response. If somebody comes and makes an accusation, especially if you're guilty, it's an instinctive response. So impulse control is only the first layer of this. Now we talk about something far deeper. The degree of self-control that the Beinoni is supposed to have, this klal gadol, this core principle of the service of Hashem that a Beinoni experiences, is to control nature. What does it mean to control nature? The nature of a human being is you get a fright, your heart races. We're supposed to have so much dominance of the mind over the heart that doesn't happen. Let's take it a step further. So, and this is a hard one for us to swallow because I'm sure everybody here can relate to this in some way or another. Very often, situations arise, and in those situations we say, there's nothing I can do, this is how I am. Right? Very often we say that. Now, I'm not talking about that we just say that in the sense of, this is how I am and I can't grow. I'm not saying that. Because that's just a cop-out. When a person says, this is me, take it or leave it. That's a cop-out. But what we are talking about over here is, we're talking about where a person says, look, I am too soft. Ever heard somebody say that? That's my nature. It has a lot of value. I'm a very benevolent person. I'm a very tolerant person. And so you can't really expect me to, for example, discipline my children. It's a classic example. Some people are great with that. They understand boundaries. They understand limits. They don't feel guilty over it. They appreciate that this is the responsibility that a parent has. They understand that healthy boundaries create safe spaces for the children, which is better for their development. Some people understand all of that in theory, but they just can't relate it because they're softies. Because they're good people. They're good-hearted. They're tolerant. They're benevolent. So the person says, I just can't do this. My nature, this is not my impulse anymore. My nature, the makeup of who I am, is X. I'm a chesed person. It's an authentic state to be in. There are 10 different types of energies that Hashem infused into his world. And there are different streams of people who have different types of souls. In fact, we're told that the 7 branches of the golden menorah in the Beis HaMikdash represented the 7 streams of souls that exist. What do you want from me? That is my nature. That's how God designed me. It's not my impulse. It's my whole wiring. Well, to be a Beinoni means to be able to control that nature. And if it's not appropriate at this moment to be a kind person, then I'm going to have discipline at this moment. And a Beinoni is not at the level of the tzaddik who has completely mastered that ability, where they can literally go from one extreme to the other and do something totally against their nature if it's aligned with what Hashem wants. But the Beinoni has to aspire to have control of the nature within. It's an incredibly powerful thing. So how do you do that? Al yedei or Hashem hamer lenefesh hoilikis shebemoyach. The way you do that is you have to turn up the intensity of the light of the neshama, because every one of us has a neshama. So you've got to turn up the intensity of the light of the neshama, which we call the godly soul, which functions primarily through the intellect. In simple English, the more I understand what I should be doing, the more I'll be able to control myself to do it. The more I appreciate the value of why I should be doing that, or the more I value how much Hashem wants me to do X, the more likely it is that I'll also start to feel that way, that I'll also start to behave that way. And so the core focus that the Beinoni has to work on is that shifting from what I am naturally inclined to what Hashem wants of me. Now, that's not a surprise. This is very much aligned with what we learned in the previous chapter about the concept of contemplating Hashem's greatness, reaching a point where we have such an acute appreciation of why it's worth our while to have a commitment to Torah mitzvahs and why we should have a relationship with Hashem, etc., etc. And then that will filter down into a feeling as well. It will filter into our love of Hashem, etc. And that's we're going to review that again next week, just very briefly, that process, which will then bring us to the second fundamental principle. And that second fundamental principle will address our issue, well, what depth of experience can I have if I'm not yet at the full scale of the experience? Okay, so that's where we're still going to go.
Ask Rob.